Danny Glover for a very long time for all of his films, but it just, I think, is really important that he's here today because many of you might not know the incredibly deep and long work he has done advocating for Latin America and going down to many of the different countries in the hemisphere to listen to people, to hear their stories, to find out what's going on, and to come back to the United States and really advocate, particularly for people of African descendants in Latin America, but actually for all people in Latin America and the Caribbean. And so we really honor his work and using his position to advocate for that. And also, obviously, Mark Weisbrot, who is an economist and the co-director and co-founder of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. He co-wrote the film, and that's why, obviously, we see a lot of important contributions to actually link the economic issues, talk about poverty reduction, talk about the history of the IMF in the film, some topics which you don't often see discussed adequately in the Latin American context. I also just wanted to quickly thank our event co-sponsor, which is Trans-Africa Forum, and if Imani Countess is still here, I'm not sure if she wanted to make any comments.
Actually, Nora.
Okay, go ahead, Nora.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
Good evening. I'm Nora from Trans Africa, and we wanted to thank FIFA for the work that they're doing and the invitation, and of course, recognize Danny who's our board chair today. I think something that really was that I feel present and really excited about from this film coming out of it was the way that progressive movements on the ground in Latin America have really pushed these leaders to even be elected, and what we can learn from them, especially in Trans-Africa's work around the Afro-descendant issues, I think is like pretty profound. Colombia is something that wasn't talked about, and I think it's because of the challenges that the U.S. government has had with Colombia. But I'd be interested to hear the panelists talk a little bit about Colombia because in Colombia there's such a highly linked civil society movement, and they have some of the most progressive laws. They just have not been implemented. So how we can look at the places where the people are, much more progressive than the leaders that the U.S. is allowing to come to leadership. So thanks again, Weaver, and I love that all. Thank you.
So we're going to ask our panelists to just give a couple of brief comments about the film. I'm sure that one of the things that caught my eye was just thinking about, it sort of wrapped up at a moment when there was a little bit of hope about what would happen with the Obama administration. And I was actually in Trinidad during that summit when President Chavez gave Obama that book, and there was so much excitement, even among the staffs of all the presidents there at that time, that things would really change. And it'd be interesting, I think, to pull that into the conversation a little bit about what has changed, maybe what hasn't changed, and particularly if there's anything that members of Congress could do to sort of move that process along. Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Deborah James, the director of the international program here at the Center for Economic and Policy Research as well. So without further ado, I think our speakers, Mark and Danny, know which one you want to
I think we need to thank Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone's career has been characterized by one where he's often stepped
diminishing capacity of the Mother Earth. And who talks about it more eloquently than the president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, who in a sense talks about the relationship to that and the people's prosperity and their health and et cetera, et cetera. No one has been able to talk about that and put it place it so place within an idea and a construct which emanates from what people's real lives and how people's real lives are about. These are the kind of voices that we have to listen to and understand that they represent the most basic and most primary needs that we have ourselves here, that we have. That when we show a movie that we did, that my company produced, Bamako, which is about the African debt crisis, which is not only the reality for Africans, but when we showed that movie to President Chavez, it's a reality. The same voices are out there. And it's very important. We can show that movie in New Orleans. We can show that movie in any other kind of place in this country. And it resonates with people because they see the same factors which affect their lives and diminish their lives and determine what happens in their own history. It is our opportunity, as Michael Jackson said, to tell our story. History is his story. Let's make our own story.
Thanks a lot for that, Danny. And I just had a couple things with the questions. I'm glad you mentioned that idea of being on the right side of history. I think that's one of the main purposes of that film. You know, and also that you talked about the movements and the grassroots movement. I had a lot of that in there. That, you know, there was a cut of the film that was 2 hours long. We ended up with the presidents because I think people felt that these were voices that hadn't been heard at all in the United States, and that it was important, you know, since we had that, we had the footage, and these presidents saying things, we wanted to have that in there. So at the beginning, some of you didn't hear about it, I made this pitch because we're on the Hill, and I want to say, you know, there's another chapter we could do of this film, right? The question Deborah posed there. What did happen after Trinidad? Well, the fact is our foreign policy stayed the same. And you could even argue it's marginally a little worse in Latin America. But you can't really argue that it's been better. And that's really unfortunate, but it's the reality that we're dealing with. And you could see this, I mean, and these governments, you know, when Lula was there, when we interviewed Lula, he said those 3 things he wanted. Well, he thought that was going to be easy, right? I mean, and it turned out what happened. There was a coup in Honduras, and our government, the State Department, did everything they could to help that coup government succeed. And they're still trying that. They're still trying to get the, you know, the governments of South America, which they will not do. You know, UNASUR, the official position, is not to recognize the government of Honduras still because it was elected under a dictatorship that did not allow free campaigning, that beat people and arrested them and closed down the media. And so our government has been fighting still on the wrong side of history, and I can give you a lot of other examples. We still don't have ambassadorial relations with Bolivia. Okay? We still have trade sanctions against Bolivia. And one of the reasons we can't settle that problem with Bolivia is because we're spending millions of dollars, our government's spending millions of dollars there, and won't disclose where it goes. And of course, the government there assumes, with great historical recent history, that they are funding opposition groups, some of which are violent. And so these are the kind of things that we're still dealing with. So what I'm going to say, and then I'll stop, is that I really do want, if anybody is representing a congressional office, I really would like to talk to you about following up on these things, following up on the investigation that Senator Dodd ordered in 2002, following up on the inquiries that the members of Congress who I mentioned, including Representative Grijalva, went after the IMF for their role in supporting, finding out who made these decisions. Just getting that, you know, that is where Congress can make a difference. Those of you who are old enough to remember the Clark Amendment in 1976, the Boland Amendment in 1984, those were huge things that really, at least in the situation changed foreign policy in Africa and in Central America. And this is the role that Congress can play when there's enough grassroots pressure and when there's enough members of Congress who are willing to play that role. And that's what I'm going to keep fighting for as long as I'm alive. Thank you.
So we'll take some questions from the audience.
Yes.
And your voice is very super close today. And really want to thank all of you for making this film happen and for your vision. Two questions. First, why is this film only being shown in Virginia? So at one theater? Maybe you want to shed some light on that for us. And I guess I'm wondering on, especially a day when the IMF is almost being celebrated for granting debt cancellation to Haiti, when we know that that's sort of giving with one hand, but on the other hand, they're saddening Haiti with additional loans. I guess I'm wondering if you can maybe have some commentary on the IMF at the time of this momentum in Nigeria. Many of us thought the IMF was on a decline. It was actually strengthened its power and strengthened its purse. So, I'd just love to kind of hear your take, and you get to take this on the U.S. front, but on the international front, in terms of what the impact of this incredible momentum has been on the real balance of power.
I could take the IMF part if you want. Well, also, in terms of the theaters, Oliver's done 6 documentaries. This is the only one that's been in a movie theater, okay? And it's in dozen, I don't know, 20 theaters around the country. And we, New York, LA, being held over in San Francisco. So we consider that a success. We thought we'd be lucky if it got on TV. On the IMF, I think that the IMF definitely has resources beyond. It's never had anything like this. They've got $750 billion now. And of course, we fought that big battle to try and attach conditions, at least that Congress, and we lost. That was something that President Obama really fought for and got it. And but I have to say that power relations in Latin America have not changed with respect to the IMF. The IMF had just a few years ago a $20 billion loan portfolio in Latin America and the Caribbean. It has now less than about $1 billion. So even though it's got a huge, it has made a huge comeback relative to what it was in 2007 because of the world recession and because of all the Eurozone crisis. And they have not gotten back into the areas that kicked them out. And that's true for Latin America, that's true for the middle-income countries of Asia. So that kind of consciousness, once it reaches a certain level, is irreversible. The IMF would not be allowed back in Bolivia, in Argentina, in even Brazil, which paid them off in just a few years ago, all the remaining debt, like Lula mentioned in the film. So those are irreversible changes.
There's a question that I have in reference to the IMF. Because for those who understand a little bit about history, we know that the Roosevelt administration made certain concessions to Latin America, given the diminished power of the U.S. to act at that particular moment, to act effectively at that particular moment in assuming or generating its own interest. Do we see what makes this particular moment one in which we see different than the other moment, where this assertion of these particular countries have now created a new era? Why do you think that's irreversible at this particular point in time? In other moments, there were that same, particularly in Latin America, the same thrust in different ways. I mean, Latin America, as witnessed by the Bolivarian Revolution, has been a politicized place for a long time. The issue
mean, when I say irreversible, I don't mean that, we can't lose things. I mean, we lost Honduras, for example. That was the weakest link. It's not gone forever. There's a very powerful resistance movement, and I think they will come back. But we did lose an elected president who was overthrown in the style that, happened in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and that was a big setback. But on the other hand, it's not just you have all these governments. I mean, Brazil, the Workers' Party could lose the election in the fall. It's not. I would bet that they'll probably win, but it's not impossible. They could lose. They have the same problem that Venezuela and Bolivia and Ecuador and Argentina have. They have a media that's against the government and very powerful. And so you can lose. But what has happened, I think, in the last decade, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted to make this film, because we think this is a huge historic shift, an epic-making change, is that there's been institutional changes so that the rules of the game have changed. You have UNASUR, which is the Union of South American Nations. They're a real force. They have acted several times to prevent the United States government from using its influence to reverse these things. I mean, they got caught unaware on the Honduran coup, and it was unfortunate that the United States has a military base there. They're too close to the United States. If that had happened in Bolivia or Paraguay, I think the other countries would have intervened. And so they have those institutional structures. They intervened in 2008 in the Bolivian situation when there was a destabilization, there was a violent attempt to overthrow the government, and the United States government was trying to force the Bolivians to negotiate with the extra-parliamentary, the violent opposition, and the UNASUR nations got together in Santiago, and they said, no, we all support the Bolivian government. They forced Colombia even to sign on to this as well. When the United States decided the Obama administration decided to expand the military bases its presence of military bases in Colombia, UNASUR, once again, they had a big fight, and they said, okay, you're going to have that, because they couldn't really force Colombia not to do it. They said, we have to sign an agreement that none of there can be no forward operations out of these bases into any other country. And so the rules of the game have changed, and that's what happens. And that's why I think our government fought so hard in Central America in the 1980s and supported the killing of so many people and spent hundreds of millions of dollars. Because they knew that if they lost even this small area, this relatively poor, small area, that this could happen. These rules could change and institutions could change. And it's an ongoing battle every day. In February, just one more example, in Mexico City, it was in Cancun, all of Latin America and the Caribbean voted to create a new alternative to the Organization of American States, a hemispheric organization without the United States and Canada. And that was based on their experience with Honduras, that the United States government, the Obama administration, blocked the OAS from taking the measures that they would have taken if they had not been in there. And they always get a couple of other right-wing governments to go along, but they don't want that anymore. So again, it's a long process, but I do think we've reached some irreversible progress. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Mark Harrison here with the United Methodist Office. I have two questions. The first one is, I don't see much in the newspaper about Chavez anymore. I was just trying to figure out what's going on with that. And I wonder if you noticed the same thing. And the second question is, what happened to the Bank of the South that was supposed to be free?
Well, the Bank of the South is moving along. It's just been slower. It got slowed down a lot by the recession. People, it was harder for countries to put up reserves, during the recession because they needed them in order to be able to carry out expansionary fiscal policies. And so, that was a problem. But they did increase the commitment. A couple of years ago it was only $7 billion. Now it's $21 billion. So I think it will happen. Just a lot of other things came up and slowed it down. On the media, it is an interesting question. You you will see a lot more about Venezuela in the coming month because they have elections in September. And part of what our government does is they campaign internationally against the government of Venezuela in all of their elections so that it gets picked up in the Venezuelan press and it has more legitimacy because the Venezuelan press is, it's like Fox times 100, and so it's not always taken seriously. And so they like to have other sources. And they started in February with all the charges about terrorism. And you can see the Republicans in Congress just 2 days ago, they started pushing for more action against Venezuela in order to just create news. And it's true. And then the other thing that's been happening, of course, which, not to be conspiratorial, but President Uribe is very close to the United States, and he's just started a campaign about, why are there FARC guerrillas in Venezuela. For those who don't know, there's been guerrillas from Colombia in Venezuela for 60 years. You cannot police a 2,000-kilometer border. There's no evidence that Venezuela supports them in any way. But that's going to be part of the campaign from now until September, and you will see a lot of news. The simple answer to your question, why there isn't a lot of news, is our media does not pay very much attention to Latin America in general. It's mostly just the kind of crap you saw in the film.
If I can just add something to that too, I think a lot of us feel like in terms of the media coverage of Latin America that less is actually better because so much of the media coverage actually has such a biased perspective and is not really reflecting the actual things that are happening in the country. But I also think it has to do with, Latin America in general. If you talk to people who are, really involved in foreign policy and really looking at the threats and the serious issues of foreign policy today, like North Korea and what's going on with our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and Pakistan and all these other places, Latin America doesn't come onto the radar screen. It's far too democratic and peaceful for it to be a top line sort of issue for the Obama administration. And what that's unfortunately meant, though, is that a lot of the sort of underlings who are in charge of the policy, still coming from a sort of Cold War lens or a good left and a bad left lens, have been left in charge of that policy. So we're still seeing, some of that happening, but it's really not going to be, a top tier issue because it's mostly a very peaceful and democratic region compared to some of the others that are real big issues for Obama. So there's a person here who had a question.
So I had a couple of questions, if you guys don't mind. The first one is, there's been talks about lifting the embargo in Cuba recently, and I just wanted to ask, what hurdles you guys foresee
which anyway, Lula has already said that Cuba's going to be its largest trading partner. He's already said Brazil's largest trading partner. So there's a way in which I think that Latin America, despite whatever the EU does, and Spain in particular, members of the EU does, is going to find ways in which it can circumvent what is happening. And clearly, Republicans, Democrats understand that as a possibility, that there are other ways that they may be left out of the whole scenario as Cuba begins to open up. Those are real things on the table as well in terms of whatever legislation comes from here, relaxation of the embargo, relaxation of travel arrangements, relaxation with respect to the selling of various farm goods, agricultural goods in terms of to Cuba. Has a major role, I think, in terms of understanding the practical dynamics that could be possible somewhere in the near future. I think the governments, particularly strategically, plan to various outcomes. How do you see this outcome in relationship to another outcome? And so it's a forecasting that goes on within the Beltway. In other words, it's a way of determining what the possible outcome and what the possible reaction to that outcome will be.
That's fine. Well, on the food production, I think it's been a big struggle in Venezuela because food distribution especially is monopolized there, and the big companies used it to, for example, when they had the oil strike and they tried to overthrow the government, they also, the big food distributors joined that as well, and then before the elections, they tend to join efforts to keep food off the shelves until after the election, the grocery store. So it is a big fight. They did increase food production for a while, and then in the last 3 years, it started to decline for various reasons. But I think the government, I think, is committed to food sovereignty, and it's a long-term problem in Venezuela. Because of, since the discovery of oil, basically, their agricultural sector has declined. So there are a lot of things they're going to have to do to get it back, including, having more competitive currency and some other, bigger macro changes. But I think that they definitely are committed to it, at least, and we'll get there.
Yeah, so one of the things about also food security is thinking about Haiti. Haiti for a long time, up until the late 70s, was pretty much self-sufficient in food production. The Archibald Valley had been a source from the time of the revolution, in terms of the revolution of 1804, in terms of Haiti being self-sufficient in food. The fact that Clinton apologized for his particular policies with reference to agricultural policies that were the antithesis of what the Haitians needed to be self-sufficient. It's a signal of what is important for us to understand in terms of what direction countries need to be and what direction they need to go vis-a-vis of their own self-sufficiency in terms of food and agriculture. And it's very, very key that if you begin to attack food and use food as a leverage, political leverage, it has an enormous impact on what happens in that country, and often we have to also be aware of that as well. Phyllis, you were about to say something, I'm sorry.
Well, let me first join Amira in congratulating you all on the bill. It's great that it's out and getting at least some distribution. My question was about the impact on the region of some of the developments regarding Brazil, where Brazil is now being welcomed into the G20. The Brazil-U.S. relationship is quite close. Brazil is trying to play a major role in the United Nations as one of the wannabe permanent members of an expanded Security Council, if that ever happens. And it happens a little bit with Argentina, but it's mainly Brazil because its economy is so much bigger. I'm just curious what your sense is of how that impacts the trajectory of these movements that are so grounded in civil society movements, in social movements. What happens when one of those governments is suddenly being sought after by other
said to us was, and the next election we're going to win is in El Salvador in March, you know. So he sees himself, and the Workers' Party of Dilma is the same. She's probably more, even stronger than him on these issues. They see themselves as part of this movement for independence, regional integration, solidarity. In fact, I mean, look what he did with, look what they did with Iran, the nuclear fuel swap agreement. This is another example of why, going back to the Monroe Doctrine, our government doesn't want independent governments. It changes the whole world, not just Latin America. I mean, this was big. It's still on the table, too. You know, it's not over. You know that. And so I don't see them. I know, and I will say, of course, that I disagreed and I thought it was terrible that, you know, what they did in Haiti. I think that was done out of a lack of knowledge. I think that they didn't know, they didn't have any idea that it was very similar to the coup in Venezuela. This is what happens when, you know, the media has real hegemony, like it did around Haiti. It didn't have complete hegemony in the same way around Venezuela. And but in any case, other than that, I think that Brazil, you know, they want that seat on Security Council, permanent. They're not going to get it anyway. But even if they did, there's not much they would give away for it. I mean, Celso Amorim, you know, Brazil's one. He has a long history. He fought with the Clintons over the Iraq War. They have a very, they've changed their foreign ministry. They are, I don't see them ever being like bought off in some sense. If they ever, you know, we have a saying in Chicago, never sell out until you're sure you have a buyer. I'm not sure they would even get a buyer, but if they did, I don't think, they really are, as long as the Workers' Party is in there, they're going to, it's still going to be a policy of solidarity with the rest of the region. That's going to come first. I do believe that.
Another thing about Brazil, along with Venezuela, two countries in Latin America who've expanded their relationship with Africa in so many various ways, you know. In Venezuela, over the last several years, have opened up more ambassador posts or has changed your relationship. And imagine that relationship in terms of Brazil, the ninth, 10th largest economy in the world, expanding its diplomatic ties to Africa as well. Well, quite naturally, you know, since half of the 180 million people in Brazil are of African descent. So there's a natural connection between that. In fact, if Brazil was a nation itself, of just African descent, it'd be the second largest nation outside of Nigeria. So that in itself. In fact, there's a major dialogue that's happening within Brazil around the issue of race. In some sense, co-sponsored by the U.S. State Department, about civil society, governments, about that relationship as well. So in the back of our minds, I think whether the scenarios being played out is that in the sense that this new awareness of this new empowerment of this as I say, this expansion of democracy within the context of capitalism, this new empowerment right here may have an impact on increasing the leverage or the power of African citizens in Brazil itself.
Any last questions?
In the phone, Lupa mentioned on currency and regional integration and economic. I was just looking at Chavez's body language, and there was a few times where one leader was talking, the other leader was not nodding. And so I wondered, what do other regions think about that idea of a Southern Hemisphere kind of hero?
No, Chavez is he's the strongest supporter of that, and they've been pushing for that. They're in fact working on it right now. I mean, it's a long way to a common currency, but the first step is to create a common unit of account, like the Europeans did in the 1950s, and they're trying to do that now. And it's a long process, though. I mean, it really did. It took 50 years for Europe to get where it is he's really, really equally in favor of regional integration.
I think we probably run out of time tonight. I really want to thank all of you for coming and seeing the film, and I'm sure that our panelists will be available if you have other individual questions you'd like to ask. I'd like to thank TransAfrica again for your co-sponsorship of the event. Obviously, our esteemed guest, Danny Glover, for being here and for his long history of advocacy. Representative Grijalva, obviously, for helping get the word out about it. And I would also specifically like to thank Alex Main and the rest of the CEPR team for actually pulling this event together. If you all have it.